The broadcast of the regular meeting of the Minneapolis Police Conduct Oversight Commission Policy and Procedure Subcommittee will now begin.
Thank you. Good evening and welcome to the regular meeting of the Police Conduct Oversight Commission Policy and Procedure Subcommittee for June 24th, 2021. I'm Abigail Sarah, the chair of the subcommittee, and I'm going to call this meeting for June 24th, 2021 to order. And one point of business, there seems to be someone on the call with the phone number ending in 07. We're having technical difficulties and we're unable, your line is muted and we're unable to take you off mute. So if you would like to call in, to hang up and call in again, that might help us to sort of fix that problem. Okay. As we begin, I will note for the record that this meeting has remote participation by commissioners and city staff as authorized under Minnesota Statute Section 13D.021 due to the declared local public health emergency. This meeting will be recorded and posted to the city's website and YouTube channel as a means of increasing public access and transparency. This meeting is public and subject to the Minnesota open meeting law. At this time, I will ask the clerk to call rolls so we can verify a quorum for this meeting. And if possible, when we call roll, can we also, can we vote? Can that also be an adoption of the agenda and acceptance of the minutes? Can we put those three together?
We certainly can.
That'd be great.
If there's no objection to that. All right. Commissioner Abdi.
Aye.
Commissioner Sylvester.
Aye.
Chair Sarah.
Aye.
There are 3 members present and 3 ayes for adoption of the agenda and acceptance of the minutes.
Excellent. Thank you. It's half my script. Okay. The next order of business on our agenda is a presentation by Michelle Rivero, the director of the city's Office of Immigration and Refugee Affairs, and by Ms. Vina Iyer, director of the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota. We're very lucky and very happy to have both of them here. Okay, please take it away.
Super. Thank you. Thank you so much for this invitation to be here today. I'm especially happy that I'm here because this month is Immigrant Heritage Month, and on June 20th, we just celebrated World Refugee Day. So it's very meaningful. I'm also very grateful that Vina was able to jump on with us today. So I'll just give a brief overview about the work of the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs and Immigrant and Refugee Inclusion Initiatives in the city of Minneapolis and talk a little tiny bit about the report that's part of the agenda, and then I'll turn it over to Vina, who will get more into the nitty-gritty on the subject of crimmigration, or the intersection of criminal law and immigration, as I know this is a subject that is of interest to the subcommittee. So just as a brief overview, the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs began operations about 3 years ago in July of 2018, and really started in part because of the many immigration policy developments that we were seeing at the federal level that were truly harmful to our immigrant, refugee, and new American communities. And so there was a thought that having someone who had expertise, I was an immigration attorney before starting to work for the city of Minneapolis, would assist the city, including city staff, city leadership, and residents in understanding the immigration policy changes and the impact on our immigrant, refugee, and new American communities, and helping to identify where people could go for help and assistance. And one of the things that my office does is manages the contracts that the city of Minneapolis has with our immigration legal service providers, including Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota, with the goal of ensuring that people have access to accurate and timely immigration information and advice, regardless of ability to pay, as we know that many individuals cannot afford the fees for an immigration attorney, and we have a number of robust organizations that provide this type of information information and advice to people. So another responsibility of the office is to highlight and elevate opportunities to recognize our immigrant, refugee, and new American community members, including on occasions such as Immigrant Heritage Month. So over the course of this month of June, there have been a number of events, both outward facing and inward facing, to recognize the importance of our immigrant and refugee residents, and also our immigrant and refugee staff members who work at the city of Minneapolis, as there are many. So events have included a U-Visa or UNT Visa Ordinance Lunch and Learn, which was recorded so people can learn about the UNT Visa Ordinance for victims of crime and victims of trafficking as a way that the city works to support our immigrant and refugee and new American community members. If people are interested in plugging into initiatives that the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs is leading or participating in, we do have a web page. There's an immigration bulletin that comes out regularly. Given the many changes with the Biden administration, these positive, right? It has been challenging. It is challenging to disseminate information just in writing. I mean, there are so many developments, and it's so important for people to understand what their rights are, what's changing, what's not changing, that starting in March, in conjunction with my counterpart in St. Paul, Edmundo Lijo, we started hosting a weekly immigration forum. It's an hour and a half on Tuesdays from 4:30 to 6. And our legal service providers participate, other advocacy organizations participate. It's really an opportunity to learn about what is going on. You know, we see changes every week. So it's mostly weekly. We're taking a couple of weeks off. We'll be back on July 13th. But there is on our calendar of events, the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs calendar of events, there's information about and links to the weekly forums in the event that people would like to drop in. And really, that's kind of an incubator forum too. So if people have ideas that they want to share or things that are important, not just in the context of immigration law, but things that touch immigrant, refugee, and new American communities, whether it's housing, whether it's access to culturally informed mental health care services, substance abuse recovery services, that's a space where we talk about those issues, connect people with each other, and identify strategies, you know, to take things out of that conversation and really to a point of action. So maybe the last tiny thing that I'll mention is that this year we're really focused on an internal and an external sort of analysis of what immigrant and refugee inclusion initiatives do we already have within the city and in the community? What improvements can be made, and how can we work together to improve or develop strategies that promote immigrant and refugee inclusion? And the report that was included in the agenda is part of the external facing initiative. It's called Gateways for Growth, and it's a partnership between the Minneapolis Regional Chamber and the City of Minneapolis, working with community to identify what are those strategies, what are those recommendations that will improve the quality of life for our immigrant, refugee, and new American communities. If people would like to learn more about that, there will very soon be a website dedicated, a webpage dedicated on the Minneapolis Regional Chamber website. And please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to provide more information about that. And I want to be respectful of time. And I know that Vina's got a lot of exciting information she'd like to cover. So happy to answer questions. And if there's more time at the end, maybe I can share a little bit more information too. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michelle. And thanks so much really to the city for just continuous support of our work, both through funding, but also just being an amazing partner as we work to support the immigrants of Minnesota, of Minneapolis, and particularly Michelle, who's always a fantastic partner for not only ILCM, but for all of the organizations that serve immigrants and refugees in our community. We're tremendously lucky to have her. So I just wanted to talk, first off, actually, I really want to thank
the commission for just asking the questions that bring me here today. I think that the fact that you're asking questions and making sure that you understand how it is that the criminal justice system and the immigration system intersect, and then what it is that may be done here in Minneapolis in order to better serve our immigrant and refugee neighbors is really just is wonderful. And I think it's just important questions that need to be asked. So I have a really short PowerPoint, really, I think just to make sure to be able to kind of like look at a little bit of data, a couple of ideas, and then just really get into some of the things that I think that hopefully you as a commission might find helpful in thinking about going about your work to make sure that police in Minneapolis are properly serving and are held accountable to the communities that they serve. So I wanted to start actually with a little bit of myth busting, which has some research data that's ripped from the headlines. I'm a Law and Order fan, so I like to use rip from the headlines as often as I can. This is just the result of a really great study and a very comprehensive study that was just done and released by the University of Wisconsin, which had access to a significant amount of data from Texas about criminal arrests, charges, convictions, and then also about immigration status, and was able to bring those together to test questions about what is the level of involvement in the criminal justice system of immigrants, and how does it compare to those of folks who are native born. And I think that this data really blows out of the water the myths that have been, I think, have really circulated in our society for so many years, and in some ways, I think, just back to the founding, which is this notion that foreigners, individuals who have come from other countries somehow increase the level of crime in our communities. And this study really shows that is not true. Instead, as you can see from this information, whether it's violent crime, whether it's property crime, whether it's drug violations, US-born citizens are being arrested, charged, and convicted at higher rates than lawful immigrants as well as undocumented immigrants. And as you can see, those rates for undocumented immigrants is actually much, much lower than for other communities. And so I think that it's just really important as we are thinking about policing to make sure that everybody who's part of the system really understands that when we are thinking about immigrants in our communities, we are talking primarily about law-abiding citizens that we are individuals and residents of our communities that we really want to be supporting, and not folks who are committing crimes. And of course, then there's the overlay of issues of inequities just in charging decisions, et cetera. So in some ways, I think that when I look at this data, I also say, frankly, some of these numbers might even be lower because we do know from data, obviously, that oftentimes immigrants, folks of color, are being arrested and charged at higher rates than folks who are not who are white. And so I think that data also needs to be examined in conjunction with this. Then I wanted to get to the topic that really brings us here today, which is what we in immigration call crimmigration, which is very much that intersection between the criminal justice system and the immigration system. And that's long been a feature of our immigration system, but in so many ways, it has become much, much worse and become even much more embedded into the system over the past 25 years as a result of laws and policies that have been passed at the federal level. So crimmigration is probably one of the most complex areas of the law, period, of any topic. And I see Commissioner Sarah nodding her head, and I think can kind of confirm that, as well as Commissioner McGuire, who is also a member of our staff. She can also tell you she deals with the complexities of this on a daily basis. But I don't want to, for this group, I didn't think it was important. I didn't want to get into lots of minutia for you. Rather, I wanted to really talk about big picture themes for you to keep in mind as you're going through your work, and also in talking with community about these issues. So the first point I wanted to make is that immigration law is technically civil law, i.e. it's a law that if you violate it, it doesn't result in you being shouldn't be resulting in you getting thrown in jail or into prison. But that's not how it plays out, because criminal law often drives how immigration outcomes. And the fact of the matter is that immigrants can be detained as part of the immigration system. And as a result, there's just a lot of ways in which the immigration system is very quasi-criminal. One thing that's important to know in kind of understanding in this is that immigration law has one aspect, which is conferring benefits like lawful permanent residence and citizenship. When it comes to those applications, there are criminal disqualifiers for those benefits. So oftentimes something that happened in the criminal justice system, often decades ago, can determine one's eligibility for immigration benefits now. Also, there's a portion of immigration law that is really dealing with the deportation of non-citizens, often folks who have lived here for decades and might even have lawful status. One thing that's also really important to note is just because you have a visa, just because you have lawful permanent residence, doesn't mean you can't be deported. Naturalization is the only inoculation against deportation. So often a non-citizen becomes deportable and is sometimes detained based on that interaction with the criminal justice system. And what's important to note is that without that interaction, their status might not be threatened. And in the case of the undocumented, they might never have been on ICE's radar if not for that criminal interaction. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more in terms of practical issues. The second point I want to make here is you don't need to be convicted of a crime to become ineligible for immigration status or citizenship, to become deportable, or to get placed in deportation proceedings based on that suspended conduct. Violating a civil order for protection or alleged gang activity, which is so broadly defined, can make somebody deportable without any kind of adjudication of criminal activity. There are also times when simply admitting to the facts of a crime, for example, any type of plea, including one in criminal proceedings, like for example, a stay of adjudication, which under the state system actually makes it so that at the end of the process, you don't have a conviction on your record. Guess what? Doesn't matter for immigration purposes. That can still have an impact on your immigration status. It's considered a conviction for immigration purposes and can result in deportation. The other piece here is that even misdemeanor convictions can lead to the denial of immigration status and or deportation. And even though they're called misdemeanors under Minnesota law, and the Minnesota legislature has said this is a misdemeanor, they can be treated as aggravated felonies under federal law. And that I think is really, really significant because misdemeanor theft can include things like shoplifting food from a grocery store. And that's considered a crime of involving moral turpitude, which can cause somebody not to be eligible for certain immigration benefits and may contribute to a person being considered deportable. Also, petty misdemeanor possession of marijuana is another one. And remember, even if Minnesota were to legalize recreational marijuana, still illegal at a federal level. And so those are, I think, some issues where even if Minnesota law is relatively progressive, as it would appear, as compared to federal law, it doesn't matter because the federal law trumps and how it treats the particular crime trumps. Now, there's certain things that actually can be done to mitigate those consequences. And one of those that we've been working on and that the city of Minneapolis supports and other jurisdictions support is, for example, changing the maximum conviction for gross misdemeanor convictions from 365 days to 364 days. It's a day. It really doesn't make that, but it might not seem to make a big difference. Makes all the difference in immigration law. It makes it so that certain crimes that would be considered aggravated felonies and automatically make you deportable, if just that potential sentence is reduced by 1 day, and it's the potential sentence, not the sentence the person actually gets, that can make it so that it's not an aggravated felony. So that's why these areas are just so complex. And certainly there is work that can be done incrementally at the state level to change law to make it better for immigrants. But a lot of this does need to be done at the federal level. So I'm now going to move. I was going to just move to some of the specific areas, particularly when we think about policing, to talk about in just a second. But as I do my crash course in crimmigration, which is in fact I think a class that's taught at the U at the law school for an entire semester. Any questions before I go to the next slide? Okay, and I'm just going to tell you, you have a commissioner who is actually 500 times better than at answering these questions than me in Commissioner McGuire. So feel free to, I told her I was going to tell you, you could ask her questions. And she said she was happy to answer them. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is areas for examination and potential reform, specifically focused on policing here in Minneapolis. And there are three areas I want to talk about. And then I just want to talk about broadly some of the themes that we are seeing in immigrant communities about concerns with regard to policing. So I just wanted to, I thought that the easiest way to think about this is just thinking about the different steps in how folks would interact with police if they're in Minneapolis. So the first place I wanted to start is just stops. And I think that that's a place where there's some important questions to be asked and that are being asked more broadly about the role of implicit bias and bias in stops. Certainly, I think we've talked a lot about those stops when it comes to people of color, and then particularly within the subset of immigrants. And one of the things here, and I will say, I will be, here, it's a question here. I don't feel like I have enough information to necessarily make any type of recommendation, but this is a place that I think it's worthwhile to look into a little more. So, my understanding is that most police officers, if they're, they can run a search while they're in their squad car. Let's say that they've pulled somebody over for a traffic stop and get some information on the individual. What I believe is true here, but I'm not 100% certain, is that there's at least sometimes when immigration information shows up on there. So for example, if Immigration and Customs Enforcement has issued a detainer, which note is not based on probable cause and is not signed by a judge, but some immigration officer has said, hey, we want to hold this person because we think they're undocumented or deportable. My understanding is that can sometimes show up in the system. And so one of the things that I have some questions about is whether, that information may cause, because of conscious bias or implicit bias, could result in folks actually saying, hey, I'm going to therefore pull this person in for an arrest and bring them into the jail when you wouldn't otherwise. And so one of the questions I have about that is there a way that, honestly, in a squad car, if that information isn't relevant for state or local law enforcement purposes. There is no reason that you need to have information about a detainer if the basis upon which you can arrest somebody is state or local law. And so one question is, if it could cause bias, is it possible to eliminate that information and make it not available when you're looking at information on a squad car? Really, I think about this a little bit, and Commissioner Sarah knows that my prior life is as a employment lawyer. It's essentially like banning the box for employment purposes, in the sense that you're preventing, in ban the box, you're preventing the employer from seeing information about somebody's criminal history before you interview them. Here, could you prohibit them from seeing information about somebody's immigration status or lack thereof as you're making a decision about what stopping and what to do on a stop? So that's one question. Next, when it comes to arrests, just some questions I think that need to be asked to figure out and address issues with regard to arrests. How many immigrant Minneapolitans, how many of those does a local arrest lead to detention and deportation? And then how can those arrests and bookings be reduced? I think generally we recognize that people are being booked, not just immigrants, perhaps in a lot of situations where they don't need to be. And so how can we address those? Because it's often at the jail or that Hennepin County takes over, and that's where oftentimes ICE is contacted and where you have the greatest risk of people being deported. Finally, when it comes to charging decisions, really some questions about what can the city attorney do for Minneapolis, who is charged with prosecuting local crimes. In St. Paul and Ramsey County, there are immigration attorneys on staff who are able to advise about how to charge crimes in order to minimize negative immigration consequences. Could the city attorney here in Minneapolis do that? And what's important there is just having general policies to consider the issue is unfortunately not sufficient. It's because all that complexity in immigration law means that unfortunately you can't necessarily just have across the board policies. Oftentimes, to actually have the effect you want, to make sure that somebody, or to really minimize the chance of somebody getting deported because of a particular offense, you actually need to make sure that you're consulting with an immigration attorney in making the charging decision. So those are just some things, food for thought. And then I think overall, just the note of right now, I think there are a lot of communities that are also worried about the flip side, which is that they are not getting the police and protection that they need right now and that they expect because of the lack of police coming into and protecting immigrant communities. So I think that's also a reality we need to address. And with that, I'm open for questions.
Thank you, Ms. Rivero and Ms. Iyer. That was awesome. I will now open the floor and invite comments on this presentation from the community. We will limit public comment period to no more than 2 minutes per speaker. Please press *6 to unmute yourself. And this would include commissioners. So if the commissioners would like to offer any thoughts, please do.
Yeah, I have a question. Just some clarifying things. So you said that when a person is getting pulled over or when immigration is involved, it's like a civil matter rather than a criminal matter. But the way like deportation happens is because like crimes at a federal level, and that's like kind of what takes priority. Is that kind of like what I'm hearing?
You know what? It's a little, let me make sure okay, so this is what I'm going to work through. What happens is you have a crime that's a crime at a state level. So let's say shoplifting, right? It's a misdemeanor. And we think about it, it's an offense, but it's not a super serious offense we would consider. But because federal law defines something as an aggravated felony, not based on how it's classified at the state level, but based on other criteria like what's the maximum sentence, that's where you have the issue of certain state law crimes making somebody deportable. Does that help?
Yep, that makes sense. And then how does someone, because what I'm hearing is that it would be helpful for the county attorney to have like an immigration attorney to be able to specialize in that. How does somebody become an immigration attorney? Is it just like a specialty? Is there like more training? Like what would be an incentive for more lawyers to do that?
Oh, great question. So to become an immigration attorney, I mean, first you just go to law school, et cetera. Most folks who are practice immigration law have taken several classes in immigration law, have done clinics during law school in order to do immigration. But this intersection between immigration and criminal law is like a super subspecialty. In some ways, I would say it's like the pediatric neurosurgery of immigration. And so you really have just a small group of people actually locally who are really, really well versed in these issues. So it's a real high level of specialization. Folks who have been doing this have oftentimes been doing it for years. And so there's really you really need to have a certain level of knowledge to be providing that advice.
Okay. And then, so since it is such a small group of people, like, could it be something as like the county attorney can maybe like, like seek a specialty or somebody with an expertise or whatever to kind of like consult it, so they don't have to necessarily like take the case, but they can give them like advice and like maybe like
Certainly.
create a partnership there. Okay.
Yeah, that's a very, and one thing that's important is the public defender's office actually has had a contract with us. They've actually moved it in, they're moving it in-house right now. But that has been the model because the public defender has it, but it's really important to have it on the charging side too. I think it's very possible. There's some issues with regard to legal conflicts that I think make it a little more complicated to do consulting on the prosecution side than on the defense side. But that's something that could be figured out.
Okay, thank you.
I would like to recognize myself. Oh, no, I'm going to recognize Commissioner Sylvester. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. It's very selfless of you. First of all, both of you, thank you so much for coming and talking to us today. This is really exciting. First of all, Vina, can you tell me a little bit more in your experience kind of recently, has the relationships changed with the Hennepin County Sheriff's Office and the Hennepin County Jail with Sheriff Hutchinson versus the relationship that, let's say, your organization had with Sheriff Stanek? And has the relationship with ICE changed since we have a new sheriff?
Great question. I would say that there are ways in which I think that particularly Sheriff Hutchinson is definitely more open to discussion and dialogue than Sheriff Stanek. At the same time, we do still see situations in which people are held for household. There might be calls to ICE to pick somebody up as they're going out the door from the jail after they've been released. And so there are certainly issues and why coalitions here in Minnesota, like the Decriminalizing Communities Coalition that we're a part of, have been really pushing for and are for meetings with Sheriff Hutchinson in order to address these issues. So what I would say is, yes, some improvement. There's still a long way to go. And I think how that's seen is when you look at the number of detainees that are coming out of Hennepin versus Ramsey, it's palpably different, is what I have understood from my team.
Okay, I think that was one of the exciting things about getting a new sheriff in town, to use a phrase. And so that's interesting to hear that maybe some things are changing, but not everything. Michelle, I thank you for the work of your office and the work that you do in the city. I am blessed. I work as a paramedic for HCMC Minneapolis, so I'm blessed to work with new immigrant communities every day. And one of the fascinating things that I've found in my work is that trying to get people to who come from places that don't have a functioning 911 system to understand the 911 system. And some of the work that I think some folks do and some of the information that some new immigrant communities get is that if you need to go to the doctor, you call 911, right? And John will come get you. And that very general message, generationally, like after one generation, people start to figure out like what is and isn't acute. But I'm just wondering, is there opportunities? Does your office have any opportunities? Are there any plans for opportunities for any sort of formal gathering to better understand a functioning 911 system and public safety system for new immigrants? Like, is there any sort of resources that people can get, hands-on resources, relationship style building resources that people can get when they first get here?
Michelle, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I feel like I should have learned that by now, but thank you so much for that question. I will say that with regard to our office, it's a one-person office within a larger department, the Department of Neighborhood and Community Relations. And this department has cultural community specialists who work with our different cultural communities, including an individual who does outreach with the Southeast Asian community and another who does outreach with the Latinx community. With regard to public safety and learning about how to access supports and assistance, whether emergency or not, these individuals are really critical because of the fact that they are basically embedded in the different cultural communities. There is always room for improvement. You know, the fact that the city of Minneapolis has a robust language access support system is extremely useful. From the standpoint of broader public engagement, I know that there are initiatives that have begun from the standpoint of the Office of Violence Prevention that have a component of sharing resources and information about how to access city staff. But I think that there is an opportunity there to do a broader reach out with cultural communities, including communities where perhaps we don't actually have a representative in the city that does consistently do outreach with those communities. And I think that the reports that we received through the New American Economy work and our initiative with the Gateways for Growth program really is an opportunity for us to see where we can dedicate resources to offer more robust engagement to the question that you raised.
Okay, I'd love to connect offline and, you know, provide a resource as far as bringing an ambulance to folks and, you know, putting folks in that space and getting people comfortable with that space. Also, I think I'll close with this. There were some infographics about immigrant populations that were in the materials for this meeting, I think, that Abigail sent around. I'll let you know, we this week we're going to share those among the staff ahead up in EMS, just kind of as a learning opportunity to learn a little bit more about the folks that we do serve and kind of deepen our connection with those folks that we do serve. So I really appreciate your office putting those together, and we're just taking upon ourselves to kind of ingrain our staff with that information. And it's a really beautiful set of infographics. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. If I could just make one quick comment on the population, you know, our population includes approximately 63,000 individuals who were born outside the United States. A significant component of that, about over 20,000, are people who came as refugees or likely refugees. And thinking about the unique dynamics within our refugee community, certainly the resiliency and the courage and the strength, but also the trauma that people experienced in their journey before they came to the United States, really thinking about from a policing standpoint, as well as from a basic health standpoint, ensuring that we have resources available and that the people who are working with those communities have trauma training is something that I think is a worthy area of research and study too, from the standpoint of this group. So thank you again, appreciate it.
Absolutely. And I will say, just to toot our little horn here, HCMC is a national leader in psychological trauma for victims of torture, specifically because of our access to those immigrant communities that make our society, our city, so much more dynamic just by them being here. So thank you both for coming.
Thank you.
We have an all-star cast tonight, just so everyone's here. I'll recognize Commissioner Abdi, and I would respectfully request that we keep it kind of short because we do have another speaker, and I just want to make sure that we kind of move forward after Commissioner Abdi's question. So last question with Commissioner Abdi, please.
Yeah, I just have a question about like traffic stops and about like exposing the information of immigrant status. Is there any like initiatives or like an outline of like what that would take? Is it just like a systems change as in like taking it off, or like cost or anything around that?
Since I brought it up, I'll mention it. But as I'll give you the warning, which I gave to Michelle yesterday. This was Vina thinking about, I just through a couple of interactions, understanding more about information that could show up in a traffic stop, and just starting to think about what we could do. No research has been done on this. It has just been, it's something where I have some questions to ask. And I do think actually their first question is just to make sure that, like, understanding exactly how much immigration information is involved in those stops. I don't want to, my understanding it is, but I'm not 100% sure. So I think that question first needs to be asked. If it does, then I think it's some questions about, hey, would it be helpful and could we find a way to reprogram those computers So this information doesn't show up. So I think it would ask some questions, and then yes, agree, costs, et cetera. And then of course, like there may be some reasons why needing that information may legitimately be needed. But again, maybe get the legitimate information, but the other information, keep it out.
Thank you both so much. Excellent question, Commissioner Abdi. With that, and without objection, I will again thank Ms. Rivero and Ms. Iyer and direct the clerk to receive and file this presentation. Thank you so much. Next on our agenda is a presentation by Dave Bicking, a member of Communities United Against Police Brutality. And this will be about arbitration and CUAPB's disciplinary reset proposal. Thank you, Mr. Bicking. Please take it away.
Thank you. Just by way of introduction, I've been following the PCOC meetings since they started in 2013, looking at discipline. I was a member of the Civilian Review Authority for 2 years prior to the formation of the OPCR. And so I've been looking at discipline and accountability for police for a long time now. It's a difficult, complex problem. I'll try to just summarize this particular aspect of it regarding arbitration and the frequent failure of discipline to be upheld in arbitration. First, I want to take just a brief look at the problem. I think it's the fourth link on the agenda is a slide showing the number of complaints coming in and the amount of discipline that results from those. This was from the period from the beginning of the OPCR in October 2012 to the day that George Floyd was killed. The civilian complaints that came in, people, members of the public who came in and filed a complaint, gave their statement, you know, the whole shot that went through possibly investigation, possibly, you know, the panel, possibly further on. In that time period, those 2,783 complaints led to discipline in only 13 of those civilian complaints. That's a great outlier from any other city with a supposed civilian review. Complaints that came from inside the police department fared better. About 5% of those led to discipline, but that's still only 25 complaints that led to discipline that came from within the police department. Now, you'll forgive me because I've been a broken record coming to the PCOC meetings here for the last 7 years and bringing up the lack of discipline. We get this information that I just presented directly from the Office of Police Conduct Review through data practice requests. So this information is their information. I've been bringing this to the PCOC with some interest. I've been bringing it to the city council and the mayor with, frankly, no interest whatsoever. So the problem here, we're not looking so much for retribution against officers. What we're looking for is sufficient and consistent discipline to correct the actions of the officers involved and to disincentivize this kind of behavior by other officers. In addition, a lack of discipline over a period of time really reinforces a culture of impunity among the officers. We've seen that in many high-profile cases. We certainly see that in the case of Derek Chauvin, who had so many complaints and no discipline. So we've been looking for a long time at what goes wrong. Why isn't there more discipline in a department which, you know, obviously is not so perfect that it should have no discipline? All you have to do is look at the lawsuit settlements to know that there is a very serious problem with officer misconduct and brutality, but it isn't showing up in the statistics for discipline. So why is that happening? And I call your attention to, I think it's the third attachment to the agenda, which is called, you know, steps to achieving discipline through the OPCR. I've taken 3 or 4 different documents about how the OPCR functions, taken out all the other steps, where things go off to the side to coaching or mediation or dismissal, and just looked at the steps it takes to get to discipline. As you can see, it's a long document. There's many steps. Also, we find that the supposedly civilian side, which involves 2 civilians, of the OPCR, basically is a gatekeeper for the Internal Affairs Unit, which then takes a look at the cases. The Police Conduct Review Panel, the 2 officers and 2 civilians, looks only for merit. It doesn't look for the level of the offense, and it doesn't decide or even recommend the amount of discipline, simply merit. That goes to the Internal Affairs. So there's many steps there, and we have brought that again to the attention of people for a long time. I won't harp on that. The question is, and that leads into, what you've been talking about with coaching and hiding, accountability through coaching. But even then, after there is so little discipline coming out of the OPCR, some of that is overturned in a grievance procedure and an arbitration. Even if there were, say, 10 times as much discipline coming out of the OPCR and the chief's recommendation, what would that lead to? That would get you to something approaching what other cities tend to have. But if there were 10 times as much, we could figure that an awful lot of that would be overturned in the grievance procedure if even the tiny bit that is coming through is so often overturned. So, and I think the importance of this is it leads the structure and the functioning of the OPCR to sort of be a situation, well, what's the point? If an intake person in the OPCR sees something that looks pretty egregious, probably should result in some discipline, but they look at what's been happening in grievance and arbitration and say, wow, that's good, that's important. But if it has no chance of surviving arbitration, what's the point of going through the long and quite involved investigation process when we can just shunt it off to the precinct for coaching or dismiss it altogether? It just, you got to kind of cut your losses. And it would look really bad if a lot more discipline were recommended by the chief and so much of that were overturned. Because every time that discipline is recommended by the chief and overturned, it undermines the chief's authority, leading to this culture of impunity and weakening the chief's legitimate management powers. So we started looking at, and we've been involved in a period of research that's been 5-6 years or so of trying to figure out, where is the step where things go wrong? We'd looked for a long time at the OPCR, and we still do. But is it that the power of the union makes it impossible to discipline? And this, of course, is what a lot of people are saying. The union is too powerful. We should get rid of the union, or we should somehow make it less powerful. Well, the union is kind of there. We don't have a lot of control over what officers do to organize in the police federation. And there are laws, National Labor Relations Act, and so on, that gives officers the power to organize as any other public employees or private employees would have. Also, the power of the union is greatly diminished at this point. It still has a lot of power at the legislature, but within the city, very little. When I first ran for city council back, 16 years ago, everybody looked for the Police Federation endorsement. It was essential and you advertised it. Now you can be sure that there hasn't been a candidate in the last 8 years, who would even accept the endorsement from the Police Federation. It's the kiss of death. So the strength of the union certainly isn't much of the answer there. So there's the strength of the contract. What's in the contract? Why is it unusual? Why is this a contract that leads to an impossibility of disciplining compared to other labor contracts? And so we looked at the contract very carefully, all 128 pages, went through the discipline sections, all of that. It is a standard union contract for public employees. It has a grievance process and arbitration possibility, as it should. And, you know, there are moves afoot and a whole lot of people yelling about, we've got to get rid of arbitration. Well, we've got to get rid of a grievance procedure entirely. First of all, you can't do it. Secondly, you'd use a whole lot of political capital fighting all the other public employee unions who would quite rightly see this as a disaster for them as well. This is not the direction to go, is to get rid of grievance process and arbitration entirely. And besides which, it is certainly the case that sometimes police departments, even our police department, discipline an officer for the wrong reasons. And they deserve to have that process. Discipline for, you know, unfair discriminatory things. You know that a number of African-American officers were demoted. Discipline for whistleblowers, that sort of thing. It's correct for officers to have protection as other unionized employees have against that sort of thing. So the contract is quite normal. That left us scratching our heads. Okay, where do we go from here? We took a look at the selection of the arbitrators. And how is that done? That's done in the same way as is done for any other union contract, whether it's public employees or private employees. And I believe, and somebody may correct me on this, but I believe a state law has just passed selecting a group of arbitrators at the state level. So you don't get this thing of, well, we only get the arbitrators who solve half of the cases one way and the other half this way, so that people will continue to choose them. So, but that doesn't seem to be the fundamental problem. So we figured the arbitrators are biased for the police. And, you know, there might be some of that. But we looked through, started reading through arbitrations. We're limited in how many of those we can look at, because if there isn't final discipline, we can't see the arbitration or any other part of the file. So, and of course, if the discipline is upheld, that doesn't tell us very much about how and why the police department loses an arbitration. So we just have the arbitrations to look at where the discipline was not upheld, but some discipline was imposed. Commissioner Sarah has a link to one of those on the agenda, the case of Peter Brazeau, for instance. And we've looked at some other ones, and not just from Minneapolis as well. And I'll have to say, you know, having personally read way too many of these, that there are some cases of arbitration where it starts off with the facts and the level of misconduct or abuse is horrifying. I mean, just absolutely bone-chilling. And yet, when I get through reading that arbitration and say the termination is overturned, I have to say I agree with the arbitrator. It's terrible. But why is that? It's because arbitrators have standards they have to follow. For labor arbitration, there's 3 basic standards that an arbitrator has to go by. The first one is pretty obvious. The employer, in this case the police department, has to prove its case. It has to document that the officer really did do what they're accused of doing, and with a certain level of proof. It's certainly level far below a shadow of a doubt, you know, in the criminal case. But nevertheless, they have to prove that and document it. And Minneapolis has lost some arbitrations, frankly, because their investigations were just horrible. And then the arbitrator has said so. That's not the biggest step. The second thing is that the discipline has to be progressive. If it's a more minor offense, you know, a major offense, a killing or something like that, or a severe beating or something, one time and you're out. I mean, there's no progressive discipline for somebody who just goes berserk after a maybe otherwise okay career. But things like, you know, being late to work, you don't, you know, not mention it for 2 weeks and then fire someone. You have to have progressive discipline. That doesn't come up in most of the ones because they're more egregious cases. Otherwise, they go to coaching. The third one is the really critical one, and that is the consistency of discipline. And this is a basic union principle. It's why people unionize in the first place. And, you know, I am not anti-union. I've been involved in union organizing myself. And I know it's not pay and benefits that is the thing that gets people to unionize. It's the fairness of treatment by the employer that, you know, as in one case I can think of, certain conduct is engaged in by 5 officers. All of them are praised for that conduct. The 6th officer does it and is fired. I'm referring to the Frank Baker case in St. Paul. The arbitrator, unfortunately, correctly overturned that termination. As it turns out, this even involved progressive discipline because 2 of the previous cases were the same officer. So a fellow who got you know, the victim received $2 million from the city, and eventually that officer was criminally convicted. I mean, it's that bad a case. But the arbitrator rightly threw out the termination because there is not a consistency in discipline. The police department didn't make it at all. In fact, made it quite clear that what he did was acceptable based on past practice. And that's the term that's really important here in arbitration, is past practice. So we need to look at this situation. We have a flyer, which is also linked to this meeting's agenda, which is just a 1-page flyer from Communities United Against Police Brutality, which lays out why we feel arbitration itself is not the problem. It is a problem in the sense that the police department is losing in arbitration. As I say, undercutting the chief and undercutting the culture. So, but what do we do here? Because if you can't discipline, because it would be inconsistent with past practice where you never discipline, and if you look at these statistics of almost 8 years of the OPCR where 13 complaints led to discipline, how on earth are you ever going to discipline? It's a catch-22. And this is where we, you know, we continued on our step-by-step research. This, as I say, this was quite a process for us over a number of years. And we found that there is a process for this. And it's true in for private companies, for public employers, and police departments. It's a process that's loosely called a reset mechanism. The problem is past practice. Or for a reset mechanism to work, the employer, the police department, has to set consistent standards for discipline. You've heard about the discipline matrix. That's a listing of the various policies with the consequences for their violation, and different levels depending on how severe the violation is, and different levels for mitigating circumstances or aggravating circumstances or repeat violations. So it's laid out. It's fairly complex, and it needs to be quite thorough. So you have to have that discipline matrix first. And then when you put that discipline matrix into effect is the critical step. You make it clear, you say to the officers that from here on out, discipline is going to be based on this discipline matrix. Past practice no longer controls. And when you do that, and then engage in consistent discipline, when you do that, you win in arbitration. And we base this on a fair amount of research. We presented this to the chief as a recommendation, Chief Arredondo, when he was still acting chief in August of 2017. This was one of 2 proposals we presented in that first meeting. And took him quite a while to sort of understand and agree to this, but we've been talking about it ever since. And that proposal is, I think it's the first attachment to this agenda, and is, I think, worth looking at because it lays out, you know, what I've been saying here and what the chief can do. And so that is the way to do it. We know that this can be done. We know that this is an existing process. For one thing, in 2009, when I was back on the Civilian Review Authority, PERF, the Police Executive Research Forum, came to the city to discuss discipline. Shortly after that, the police department made its first discipline matrix in 2009. It had not had any discipline matrix before that. They made their first discipline matrix and they put out a statement. There it was in bold print in a box on the center of the page, you know, from here on out, this is what discipline is going to be and what it's going to be based on. So they did the right thing. They did it at the recommendation of a well-established group doing police research, mostly from a police standpoint, not from an activist standpoint. So looking back, we see now, yeah, that's confirmation of what we were talking about. So what happened? Why don't we have any discipline 12 years later? What happened is that the new practice became exactly the same as the past practice. Chief Dolan was the chief at that time. He refused to discipline based on what this Civilian Review Authority recommended. And before hardly any time had passed at all, that whole discipline matrix became meaningless because there's two steps. You've got to have the reset and then you have to follow it. So the question is, or one of the outstanding questions is where is that? We have been talking to the chief quite frequently over the years, and it's taken forever to get a discipline matrix together. It's just, I don't know, every time there was a flake of snow, something was in the way. And lately there's been problems, coaching language, the review by the city attorney's office, a lack of staff that we've had recently. Those have been holding it up. In the meantime, at least for use of force, St. Paul has put this process in place as a recommendation that we put forward to them. Chief Axtell was enthusiastic about it, and he's getting good results. But it's been stalled here. We're still trying to find out exactly where it stands. As of last October, when we met with the chief, it was still a little ways off. We got these problems. Some of them are legitimate problems. I know the chief has struggled with lack of staff and funding for these sorts of things. We're trying to follow up. You may recall on your May 11th agenda, the full commission, there was a city attorney's opinion, and at the bottom of that was a discipline matrix dated March 2018 and a reset dated November 2018, which really shows what we're looking at. Unfortunately, those apparently were just drafts sent to the city attorney's office. And so I have a letter out to the chief right now saying, what is the status of those? What is the status? So we need to know more about that. We need to push for that as we have been. We don't need to follow some of the other suggestions, which frankly, I think would be counterproductive of getting rid of arbitration. And then what's going to be really important is if and when this finally happens, which I think it will, if not, if the city doesn't do it on their own, the Department of Justice or somebody's going to come in and say, you've got to do this. But once that happens, it's going to be critical that then the discipline is consistent after that, which is going to require, I think, a complete reform of the Office of Police Conduct Review. And that's another area where you folks come in, and I know you're talking about that. In fact, I think it's the next item on your agenda. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Vicking. Fascinating as always, and we really appreciate your support and engagement. So thank you for being here. Regrettably,
Thank you.
I would like to open this up for questions, but we're already over time. So I do need to close the meeting. Mr. Vicking has often made himself available, so I'm sure commissioners, if you would care to email him, or I think there'll be an opportunity for us to engage with Mr. Vicking outside of this meeting. So thank you again, Mr. Vicking. With that, and without objection, I will direct the clerk to receive and file this excellent presentation. Thanks again, Mr. Vicking.
Thank you. And I'll let the commission know what I hear from the chief about the current status. I'll be sure to let you know.
Thank you, Mr. Bicking. Regrettably, we have to skip the next items of business, and I will put them on the agenda for the following month. Also, please email me if you have suggestions for topics or speakers for the next month. And all right. With that, we've concluded all items on our agenda for this meeting. Seeing no further business to come before us and without objection, I will declare this meeting adjourned.